And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Nick Gold, member of Harvard's Galileo Project, which is conducting scientific research into UAPs. He is with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, and he launched declassify.org, which is a website that makes it quick and easy for U.S. voters to call and send messages to their own elected officials. Nick, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks for having me. A couple quick things, just declassifyuap.org and Galileo Project was in the past. However, I am no longer a member of Galileo Project. I'm focusing my UAP science time on the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies. However, I was a listed co-author on the Galileo Project's lead paper that was published in the Journal of Astronomical Instrumentation last year, which was a huge honor.
While we're on that subject, what was that paper about?
People have been obviously seeing these UFO things for quite some time. I kind of considered the contemporary UFO era really to be kind of the mid-1940s when US pilots in World War II started reporting these things, sometimes even like off the wing of their aircraft, often in theater, either in the Pacific or across the European theater, that were called Foo Fighters. And the military came into awareness of this. The public was understanding that this was a thing through reporting that was happening in the mainstream media. And, that's sort of, the era of this. And I'm sorry, what was the specific question again?
I didn't know. What was this paper about?
So, yes. So Galileo actually, the project put out a handful of papers that was published in the Journal of Astronomical Instrumentation. And the lead one, which was headed by Wes Waters of Wellesley College in Massachusetts, it's interesting because, again, people have been seeing these things for 80 years, again, just in the contemporary era. And even some scientists have had interest in these things from, really even the 50s, the 60s, and onward. But there isn't really a true scientific framework, or at least there hadn't been a true scientific framework for studying the things that people see. And so that was one of the main things that the Galileo Project set out to do, to actually define a scientific framework for studying these objects that both military and civilians have been seeing around the world for, again, at least 80 years. And so the lead paper kind of sets out an entire premise for how you study these things. That includes observation systems, cameras, other types of sensors, redundancy in those systems, how you apply data analysis, even AI techniques to interpreting all of this data that's coming in. So you can really define what's an anomaly, what's the normal set of things we see moving around in airspace. And then how do you kind of use, IT systems to kind of flag the things that stand outside of normally observed, things in the sky, whether that's airplanes or birds or stars or, comets or whatever it might be. And then apply techniques to try to understand whether these things are truly anomalous, not necessarily to come to an ultimate conclusion about their nature and origin, but to even define the scientific equipment and process and data analysis techniques to start to look for these things, because people see them all the time. We know that the military and the intelligence community gathers data on them, but a shockingly small number of projects have actually really put up a lot of equipment and the time and the energy, and it's expensive. There really isn't funding for this to be done at scale at this point, but someone had to define the approach. And so that's what the main Galileo Project paper was about, and some of the ancillary papers. Now, I'm going to admit, I'm not a scientist by training. However, I do, in my professional career, I dealt with a lot of what we call schema development or taxonomy development, coming up with kind of the labels and the terms that you use to track information, metadata. And one of the thoughts that I contributed to the Galileo Project paper was, and I was very proud to have it included, was just some thinking about these terms that we use for these things, whether it's kind of the more traditional term like UFO, unidentified flying object, or this newer term, UAP, unidentified aerial and now anomalous phenomena. what's interesting about these labels is that they don't actually describe what we're talking about. If you think about it, they're almost like anti-labels. They say what we don't know about it. And so, that creates problems when we're even trying to have basic conversations. As humans, we use words. We're a very language-based species. We have labels that ideally connote meaning to people. And when we have labels for something important and something that tends to have characteristics associated with it, but the labels themselves are in no way actually descriptive of what people see, it creates just a lot of nebulousness and confusion around sometimes even the basics of what are we talking about. So, the Galileo project's work is ongoing. One of the things, I actually just saw a presentation done by Wesley Waters, who's one of the lead scientists in the project. He's just talking about how they are calibrating the equipment right now that they have purchased and designed to be observation systems, because you sort of have to know what the standard operating characteristics of your equipment even is. Like, what temperature ranges does it pick up if you're using, infrared cameras, and, what are the, just the level of accuracy that your particular equipment is providing you, so how to analyze the data that it's generating. Those types of processes in science take a while, but they're very important. So they haven't even necessarily begun looking for UFOs yet. They're really still defining the framework of the actual observation systems and the kind of data that comes off of it. But that's really critical to start to move this topic into the actual realm of scientific exploration, which sadly, for the most part, largely, I think, because of the stigma, but also because of a lack of funding, should have probably began 70, 75 years ago. And we're now just in this sort of nascent phase of getting it started. So hopefully things like the Galileo Project, the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, other projects and private efforts are starting to kind of break through that and approach the topic scientifically. I don't think that's the only mechanism for exploring the topic, but the scientific approach is useful to us. Our society is largely constructed because of what we get out of science. And so I think we need to at least be willing to incorporate our scientific approaches into our repertoire of how we're kind of trying to understand this thing a little bit better.
Well, how did you get interested in UFOs and work your way into this paper? Were you an experiencer in some sort of way?
So I'll take it way back, right? I'm in my mid-40s. Grew up in the 1980s in elementary school. I was exposed to, all of the popular culture that was sort of rapid fire at that point. I mean, everything between Star Wars, and I remember, the Star Trek movie with the whales that came out. I think that was Star Trek 4, seeing that in the theater. All of that kind of stuff, E.T., of course, video games. I mean, the theme was quite out there as I was growing up. There was, I think, when I take it back in my thinking, there was one piece of media, frankly, and one experience that I think really kind of activated me. It was the movie Flight of the Navigator, which came out in early August of 1986. Very good movie, holds up exceptionally well, to the point where it kind of feels like some of the people who were involved with the movie knew a little bit about what they were talking about through, I don't know if it was their own experiences or research or whatever, but it holds up very well. And, it's about a little brown-haired kid who was about my age as I was watching the movie as an 8-year-old, and, gets kind of taken by a UAP. But it's actually a very kind of novel and not negative experience. It's a fun adventure movie. And, I just remember being in the theater. I think we saw it at my friend Tommy's 8-year-old birthday party, either the day it came out or the day after. And I was just how do I get in on this? So, I had probably already been interested to some degree at that point. I am one of those people who just even as a child, the moment you kind of hear about these UFO things, you see in some popular culture or even through books, I was always an avid reader, that serious people have been talking about these things for a really long time. The military has done various reports on the topic back to the late 1940s. For me as a kid, And maybe it was just that frame of mind I was in from the media that I was taking in. But like nothing about the topic struck me as completely outlandish. I was just one of those people who was like, yeah, that makes sense. Like space is big. We're just this little planet floating around. We really don't know what's out there. Um, is there a chance that something else is around? Is there a chance that something has taken an interest in us, either now or in the past, or who knows? It just didn't seem that odd to me. I don't know. I'm like, yeah, this place is pretty interesting. Like, I can imagine someone else getting wind of it and like maybe staying a little interested and seeing what's going on with those humans of Earth or the planet. So, I just kind of followed it for my entire life. I mean, I remember doing a presentation in undergrad, what brought me here to Baltimore, the college I was in. I think it was probably freshman or sophomore year. And I was researching some of these early government reports on UAP from the late 40s onward. And it's very clear. You read these things and it's like, the military just talks about them as if it's a real thing, and it's confusing, and people are seeing these with some regularity, and they tend to fall into certain categories as far as their shapes and their characteristics. And so, like, for just a lifelong, I have stayed attached to it. I got interested in the internet at a relatively young age, probably around 92. I was really starting to get into it. I was in junior high. You had a modem in the old 286 computer, and was connected through the University of Massachusetts. I grew up in Western Mass. And we could like get onto the internet through a dial-up connection. So I plugged into communities of interest online around this topic, over 30 years ago, almost 35 years ago now. So I was able to kind of follow it and stay up on it. And that, just staying on top of it is part of what allowed me to have that opportunity with the Galileo project for about a year. Avi Loeb, who some people will recognize, he was talking about that interstellar object Oumuamua that came into the solar system a few years ago and hypothesized that some of its anomalous characteristics might be indicative of some kind of technology at play. He was doing a Reddit Ask Me Anything, and someone had asked him, this was just a few weeks after announcing the Galileo project, and someone had asked him about fundraising, and are you looking at doing kind of crowdfunding at all? And he was like, not really, I don't know much about this, but here's my email address, and so if anyone feels like helping, reach out to me. So a lot of people ended up doing that, but I was like the second or third who ended up getting in touch with him. And I'd say a group of maybe 5 or 6 of us kind of slipped in through the window that was cracked at that brief moment to kind of get into the Galileo project. And I originally began just on kind of the public relations team, helping kind of craft. I mean, even, some of my friends who slipped in with me were working on the logo. I was offering some feedback to that, although, other people were primarily involved, but even just crafting the communications and all of that stuff. But then I was invited by Avi and some of the other project leads to join the actual research team, which I was on for a while, because it was, I think people saw that I knew the topic well because of some of my schema and taxonomy development background and thinking through the terminology and the language of it and the labeling systems for these things. I was able to, bring some knowledge base to bear with that stuff. And that's kind of how I slipped in. When I left Galileo, I ended up joining the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. I've been working with them as a so-called contributing member. Again, I was working with their public relations team, but we're also in the early stages of maybe starting up a project around how to properly label not just the UAP objects themselves. When you study something or you build systems around things, you need to come up with standardized systems of kind of the terminology you're using for the IT systems that are involved, for the classes of data that you're capturing, hypotheses about what these things might represent. We can just use random words, but in many fields, defining particular schemas of terminology and what the defined meanings of those terms are and how they relate to one another, that's a really important process of kind of organizing an effort around a particular topic. So, that schema development side is something I'm in the early stages of working on with SCU. But The scientific side is interesting. However, as I said, I'm not a scientist by training. I like to think I think scientifically. I've been fascinated with science and technology since I was a little kid. Again, very early involved in, getting online with the internet, what was not yet called social media, but, and ended up evolving into social media. But, I also wanted to bring something else to the table that I wasn't seeing, which was a little bit more of this activism side that I'm sure we'll talk about.
As you already know, what's really popular right now is Lou Elizondo's new book, Imminent. Have you read it? And if so, can you give us your thoughts about it?
I did read it. And I should say I met Lou briefly when I was with the Galileo Project. He was at one of the conferences that I attended, and I, got to meet him and his lovely wife, and got good vibes from the guy. I've always responded very well to what he does. I want to say that doesn't mean I have to vouch for every detail of what he said. It doesn't mean I have to agree with every aspect of his career in the DoD and the intelligence community. I'm really looking at him as far as how he's portrayed both his involvement with the UFO UAP issue, kind of the consistency of the story he's been telling, what details is he relaying, and what is he kind of saying is definitive. I really use this framework because, again, I've been following people, including military people, who say things about this topic for decades and decades. So I had sort of a framework for evaluating this stuff because, well, remember, it was that December 17th, 2017 New York Times story, and there was also one the same day in Politico with those 3 Navy videos. It was originally 2. Another one came out a little bit later. The stories of these Navy pilots who saw the Tic Tac in 2004, these other incidents off the East Coast around the 2015 timeframe. And suddenly this issue that I've been interested in my whole life was above the fold in the New York Times in a way that I had not experienced. Things like that had happened in the 50s, but I hadn't seen that in the UFO world scene for my entire life. So something palpably changed, and Lou Elizondo was a very significant person in that story coming out, and then the story kind of developing legs over the last almost 7 years now. So going to the book, what I found, I won't give it away. I think people ought to support the book. I think it's well written. It's fun. It hit the New York Times #1 bestseller, and I think there's a reason for that. It's really engaging. To me, it's very consistent with the story he's been telling for almost 7 years publicly now. So it didn't fall outside of it. It added a few new significant, I'd say, kind of wrinkles or tidbits that kind of fill out what he was exposed to in his time working on this ATIP program. That was sort of our understanding is it was kind of a dotted line to this other program that Senator Harry Reid and a few other senators kind of funded and got started that was called OSAP. And Elizondo had gotten pulled into that at one point. And then when the OSAP contract and that work, fizzled out, Lou sort of kind of took on, especially the military encounters with these things, kind of as part of his set of responsibilities at DoD for a few years after that, until he left in 2017, really when that New York Times article came out, because he wasn't frustrated. He was frustrated with the response that he was getting and the kind of lack of interest that some people seemed to be paying this on the inside of DoD. So overall, the fact that it's so consistent to me anyway, with the data points he's been providing, how he's characterized himself, his own involvement with the topic, I find that very compelling. People who are consistent year over year over year, and especially when new pieces of info come out and it just kind of reinforces the same story, to me, that's pretty compelling. I've talked with a lot of people who have known Lou Elizondo, who have worked with Lou Elizondo, who knew of Lou Elizondo. Most credible people think he's very for real. Like, he was not just some random guy in the intelligence community. He was what people who follow this stuff would maybe call a really serious operator, like the kind of guy who was doing really intense stuff around the world, including the Middle East, anti-terrorism operations. Again, I don't think a person has to kind of love it or hate it or whatever, but he was very involved with Guantanamo Bay and some of the anti-terrorist operations that were going on there with some of the terrorists that still are there. So he was a guy who was assigned very serious roles to be involved with some of the DoD and the intelligence community's most sensitive types of operations and programs. Again, not just some random dude, a really serious guy that people in the DoD and the intelligence community took really seriously. And those folks know he's a real serious operator. So, he talks about some of the other events and people he met along the way who reinforced, because he wasn't a UFO geek. He got pulled into this at DoD and the intelligence community as a guy who was like, yeah, I'm kind of peripherally aware of this, but I've never been one of those geeks who deep dives into it. He was kind of coming at it with a largely fresh perspective, which I think is a really useful thing for him to have done, because he could kind of take the data points that he was getting exposed to over these several years of involvement with the topic on behalf of DoD and build his own picture for what was going on. And of course, that's informed by things that we don't have in the public domain at this point. So, he clearly has been exposed to certain types of intelligence assessments, media of these things, recordings that unfortunately the public doesn't have access to right now, but clearly are part of what compelled him into feeling that this is a very real thing. So the book is, I think, again, excellent, fills out some more details. It's also a really good kind of primer for people who might not know as much about the history of the government's involvement and how they approach this topic. Really, like, it doesn't assume you have a lot of knowledge about the topic from that perspective. So it's a really good read. I actually really enjoy the audiobook. He's the narrator of the audiobook, and he's got a great public speaking voice and whatever. And I think listen, you have a podcast where people share their stories. I like that I can hear his story literally in his own voice as he's telling it. People are free to kind of judge it as they will. I don't think we should hinge any of our beliefs about the topic just on what people have told us, even if they have privileged access to information. It should inform us. It should, tell us there's something to this. I'll give you just another example. H.R. McMaster was very high-level intelligence official in the U.S. government, was on Bill Maher's show last night, and September 6th, and was asked by Maher about UFOs. And he gave a very emphatic response that these are real, and they do things that our current science does not have an explanation for. He's not a whistleblower. He was a very high-level intelligence official. He's accompanied by former head of the CIA, John Brennan, who has said these things might represent other forms of life. He's accompanied by, I think, 3 DNIs. The DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, is the highest official in the U.S. intelligence community. We have multiple DNIs that have come out that have said these are real. Current DNI, Avril Haines, has said we're trying to figure out if some of these ones might be extraterrestrial. So we have this ongoing and building set of public officials, high-level folks, again, not just whistleblowers, not just pilots, like the highest people in the intelligence community for some of the first time ever, verifying that there is absolutely something to this. And I think Elizondo has been central to getting us to the point where some of those other officials, including Obama like a year ago, are saying these things on the record. It's not the end zone, but Lou has been a real big part of getting us to the end zone. And I'll just say this, and it's not a giveaway of the book. I don't think it's a spoiler. I was very happy how he ends the book, because like a lot of people have written about this topic or done shows on this topic for many, many years. And again, there's the experiencer community, and they're going through their thing and approaching it from their angle. But for anyone who's just kind of casually interested in the topic or even fascinated with the topic like I've been, there's a lot of information. But then it's like, what am I supposed to do with this information? We're talking about like cosmic scale stuff, possibly. like biggest questions out there. Who are we? Are we alone? What's Earth's place in the universe? You can read a lot of stuff about the topic and just be left wondering, like, what do I do? And so Lou ends the book on the note that the next step is to pass a piece of legislation that we're trying to get passed now. It's been partially passed, but not fully passed, and we'll talk about it a little later probably, called the UAP Disclosure Act. It's literally a bill that is the legal aspect of government UFO disclosure. It was originally and still is put forth by Senators Schumer, the leader of the Senate, and Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican. It's bipartisan. And so Lou is saying we got to get this passed. And the way to get it passed is for you, the reader, or Jeff, your viewers and listeners and audience right now, is to get involved and is to pick up the phone. Treat this like an issue. We have a bill that we can try to pass. You know, again, carve out some of your interest for the topic as if it's just a political issue, like we treat other political issues. Engage with your reps. I have some specific asks to, you know, for your audience to relay with their elected officials. And, you know, that's what we got to do to push this over the finish line. And the fact that he really ends on that note and kind of grants agency to his readers, that I've kind of, me and some of the other insiders have kind of taken it up to the, you know, the 2-yard line. The public is going to be what pushes this into the end zone. And that, to me, is, first of all, is a huge amount of credibility in his favor. Because here's a guy who's saying, I'm going to say some of this stuff, and some of it sounds pretty intense, but here's what I want to have happen. Let's get the information out there and see where it all falls out, right? Let's see what comes out. To me, that connotes a certain level of confidence in the claims and allegations that are being made. But I'm a big fan of granting people agency, because I think we have a lot of power. We have a lot of power, even individually, but especially when we work together. And for him as an insider to say, but this is now really for the public to handle, I think that speaks very highly of the man personally.
If you look at the big picture, do you think that all this information that's coming out now about UAPs is because of the grassroots swelling up and forcing it? Or do you think that there are some aspects of the government that are deciding to slowly let it drip out more and more?
It sounds like a straightforward question, but it's like everything relating to this topic. I think there's a nuanced answer. At least this is what my own perspective indicates. It's also what I've been told by, frankly, some of the insiders. And in the circumstances that this has been relayed, they seem pretty emphatic about it. The government is not one thing. I've done work with the government. You know, the company I did, you know, did IT solutions for organizations that have a lot of rich media, including video, and need to store that media, you know, manage it, tag it with metadata, archive it, distribute it out, do various stuff with it, edit it, you know, broadcast it. And that included some federal agencies. And one of the things you learn is that this is a really big thing, the government. I mean, we're talking millions of employees, including across the contractors and many different agencies and fiefdoms, and even under one roof, so many little operations. And when you get into the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, and classification starts to be just another factor in this, you really get this little kind of compartmentalization. And it's by design. That's to preserve security and make sure that people aren't aware of things that, you know, they might leak or whatever. You really keep things locked down. And it makes sense from a national security perspective. But what that allows is for a lot of little pockets of activity to happen in a way that isn't always necessarily centrally coordinated. And sometimes that's useful from a security standpoint. Sometimes it causes problems, like 9/11. That over-compartmentalization and the not sharing of information between agencies seems to have been a significant part of why folks kind of probably should have been able to stem that, but the right people weren't sharing things because it was a little too stovepiped. And it causes big problems. And we can find other examples of this. So when we talk about the government doing something, I mean, yeah, we can point to specific figures of authority like the president or other high-level officials, but the government at large is literally like millions of employees across dozens and dozens of agencies with their own budgets, their own motivations, their own appointed officials that are coming in and out across administrations, as well as what some people refer to as the deep state. I don't love that terminology because, again, having worked with the government, to me, that's like, yeah, all those other people who just work in all those very large government buildings, like doing what the government does. But it can have its own issues when those people think of elected officials or appointees that are coming in and out as sort of like temporary and they don't need the details. So the story I've gotten is that the people within government or former government officials who are sort of pushing this along, getting it more into the public light, they represent a faction, a group, almost just a mentality that many, I think, government officials have that leans towards this being a much more transparent issue with the American public. And I don't know, or frankly think, that that's like a centrally organized plan. It doesn't mean that people aren't coordinating to some degree, but I don't see it as like the CIA has a plan to tell something to the public about UFOs, and Lou Elizondo is saying this at this time, and Chris Mellon or McMaster yesterday on Bill Maher's show. It's not as central as that. Those people are also government, and they believe, like I think, again, a lot of those people do, that more needs to be shared with the public on this topic. It's been compartmentalized way too long. It's not healthy for any of us. It's not healthy for democracy. So when you get just enough of those types in government over generations, it shifts sort of the tone and it allows change to start to occur. So, I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying I don't think it's like centrally managed necessarily, but it doesn't mean there aren't elements of government that aren't trying to push this along in a new way.
Do you think one of these factions of the government has the most power and is actually like a gatekeeper of all the information?
When I did work, again, in the media technology space, I worked with private sector organizations, broadcasters, some big movie studios, very significant pop stars, sports teams, people who use media. I also worked with government agencies. I worked with some contractors. I mean, being in the DC area, I worked with, nonprofits, think tanks, PACs, political action committees. I've worked with presidential campaigns on their media infrastructure. I've worked with major nonprofits that former elected officials have started. I've literally worked with like everyone from a factions standpoint as we think of it in our society. And one thing that most people don't really know details about is how classification and security clearances work, especially at the top secret level, or what we call sensitive compartmented information, SCI. So the way that class of the most classified stuff is classified is that a code word will be assigned to, it could be as simple as a concept, or a code word could stand in for like another word, but there's sort of a classified word for it. Or a code word could be associated with an entire program, or a code word could be associated with like an intelligence summary or an intelligence estimate. And if you are not read in, as they call it, to that code word, and you don't have a need to know, and you have not been granted the read in and the need to know by the people who are involved in that program that's associated with that code word, you will not know it. You should not know it. You shouldn't be hunting for it. It's very, very locked down. So the gatekeeping is inherent to the system. It's why you can't just like look up all the details of the designs of our submarines on the internet. There are gatekeepers for that class of very sensitive information. We have all sorts of stuff looking at space. We have all sorts of stuff under the ocean looking for Russian nuclear submarines and stuff like that. There are gatekeepers for all of it. So indeed, there are certainly gatekeepers for like UFO information in government. That might not just be one gatekeeper, by the way. Again, there might be fiefdoms in different agencies. They might have assigned their own code words. It's very hard to suss out. It's maybe there's some level of centralization to it. Maybe there is an agency that is more focused on this than others and is sort of running things. But, you know, the gatekeeping is just the system. Like that's how the system is designed to work. The question is whether gatekeeping in this particular situation for certain sets of information is appropriate or not. You know, people see UFOs. People see UFOs all the time. People see UFOs every week, maybe even every day. And that's not just in the US, that's around the world. So my problem is when there's something that's a fact of life, part of our world that people see in front of their eyes, and maybe even have other types of experiences around, and the officials are telling you it's either not real or forget about it, the official story and reality are misaligned. And I don't think that's a healthy thing for our minds. I don't think that's a healthy thing for society, for a properly functioning democracy, when like the authority figures are telling you it's not how you're seeing it. You know, it's like you think about, you know, Galileo, why the Galileo project is named after him, looks up through his telescope, kind of can take some observations that seem to indicate the Earth is not in the middle of everything. In fact, we're going around the sun. And you know what? They locked him up for saying that. Now, something tells me those church officials like might have sneaked a peek through that telescope and were like, oh crap. And decided not to share that because it, at the time anyway, didn't fit into church dogma. It didn't disrupt, you know, the teachings of Jesus or whatever, but like the power brokers at the time said that paradigm shift is not appropriate for how we're trying to frame things for people. So I don't think that's appropriate. I know that's, again, a long-winded response, but the gatekeeping, you know, part of me also thinks the gatekeeping is even broader than groups within the government. It's sort of like, where are we at culturally? Like we're doing maybe some of our own gatekeeping in some ways when we treat this issue like it has stigma associated with it instead of being open about it. And this is why I love what you do and what so many other people do who give light to this topic and other topics that are sometimes considered fringe, but have been like part of the human experience for a very long time. It starts to break through that. So we have to not be our own gatekeepers. And we also have to have every expectation that our own government share at least the details that brings reality and the official story into line with one another. I'll say this, again, having worked with the DoD and the IC, at least as a small portion of what I did in my career, I don't think these people are sitting around in offices all day conspiring against the American people. I mean, that has happened, but I don't think it's the norm. Most of the people in that world I ever met are just normal flesh and blood people. They tend to be pretty patriotic. They come from different political backgrounds. Some are liberal, some are conservative, some are independent, some are, you know, their own thinking about things. So, you know, I guess we just shouldn't make too many assumptions about like a them that's keeping this from us. I guess that's how I would summarize it. When we think about a them who are keeping this secret and an us, I don't know that that's even an accurate way of framing things. So as there are people within that realm who want to keep it a little more secret, there are people in that realm who think more transparency should be brought to it. And again, I care about national security. This is an if, because I don't know the answer to this. But let's say we have some recovered UFO. And even if we haven't figured out how it works, let's say we know that there is some aspect to it that's some like amazing energy source that we just even are just beginning to wrap our heads around, or maybe we haven't wrapped our heads around. And it could be very useful to us. But it could also be like a super weapon that would make nuclear weapons look like a joke. Do I think every detail of that technology, or what might not even look like a technology to us, should be put out in the public domain? so people can like try to build it in their garage. I don't know if that's the right approach. We don't do that for nuclear weapons technology, so I don't know why we would do that for something like this. We have frameworks that can build the correct kind of walls around certain subsets of information. But like nuclear power, we eventually put out there, after not too many years, that it was a thing. And we started to build nuclear power plants, not just nuclear weapons. And you can go to college and learn to be a nuclear engineer. And so I think it's time for UFOs to evolve in that direction. It doesn't mean there can't still be some little subsets that gatekeepers are in charge of because it's deemed extremely sensitive and potentially dangerous. But it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And again, a basic acknowledgement of what the thinking is, and some more data, even if it's not definitive, I think we just deserve to know what the thinking is in those realms.
Why do you think there is so much infighting within the UFO community?
It's a great question. I think there's a couple of factors at play. One is that I do think some folks, and not all of them even necessarily know it, but I do think some folks are probably being used by those who don't want to see a lot of progress made on this on the public front. And they get fed things or whatever, and they get, maybe, I don't know, developed as a kind of a market, really. So they start to like regurgitate stuff they're hearing from certain quarters that kind of raises questions or whatever. And there are some very notable debunkers and quote unquote skeptics, because I don't think they take a real skeptical approach, frankly, from a scientific skepticism perspective. They're kind of just like the debunker types who, who knows where they're hearing certain things from that are kind of developing their own views in a certain direction that then get, reiterated. We know, I mean, this has come out, it's declassified documents. In the early 1950s, the CIA decided that disinformation around this topic was the way to treat it. They had a few reasons for that. One of the reasons was they didn't want, frankly, even like Russians to be able to fly stuff around in the US and disguise it as maybe a UAP thing and getting conflated with UAP. I mean, there was a number of different reasons. They had like actual defense interests for not wanting the public to get too obsessed about UAP. But that playbook, which is probably, I imagine, like a dusty 3-ring binder from like the early to mid 1950s, and they brush it off once in a while. I think that disinformation playbook is still largely in effect as far as at least how the DoD official communications on this are framed, which is always, not necessarily saying these days that there's nothing to this, but to like dissuade thinking from like certain possibilities, or to say there isn't evidence of certain things when that actually doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. So did I answer your question fully? Is there anything else that you would tease out there?
Well, do you feel that we are flat out being lied to, or just not given the full story?
One can be the other, right? I'll give you just a very concrete example. So one of the official lines, so the DoD formulated in response to actual legislation that was passed a few years ago, they stood up a UFO office, or a UAP office at DoD, called AARO, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. And that's what's put out a handful of these UAP reports over the last few years that have entered the public domain. Some have been better than others. There was a history review that they published some months ago that was frankly total garbage. It had lots of just false information, poorly researched information, and the whole framing of it was like, kind of, there's nothing to see here that's truly mind-blowing, like those outlier possibilities. Let's just say it, like things like extraterrestrial or other forms of non-human intelligence. They were like really just trying to like say, don't pay attention to that stuff. But the funny thing is in their summary, where they're like, this is what's going on at the end of that report, the word most pops up a few times. Like, most sightings do not seem to exhibit such and such. And it's like, well, we're talking about the outliers. That's what we care about, the outliers. Don't tell me about most. My interest is in the outliers. Another thing that they like to say in their official DoD comms, when people ask about things like extraterrestrial or non-human intelligence, they say, no verifiable evidence has been found of an extraterrestrial, cause to these UAP. Verifiable evidence, yet they never define what would meet the criteria for verifiable evidence. They don't share any of the evidence. They don't provide a scientific review of how the data going through a certain framework led to a certain outcome or a set of thinking. Again, they're just kind of distracting by saying verifiable evidence. It's like, well, what about just evidence broadly? Can you just give us the evidence and maybe some scientists or other people can make up their own minds about it? So they play a lot with words. So I'm going to say, like, the answer to your question is both. It is a lie, but the lie is often not quite as far as, especially in this era, in the last 5, 10 years, or 7 years, the lie is more often spread through the creative use of language versus like an outright stark lie. However, I am open to the fact that that could well be the case as well. Here's the other fun thing. I was talking about compartmentalization earlier. If you're not read into a compartment, you do not have access to it. We don't know if that DoD UAP office that was set up by Congress a few years ago even has access to all of this stuff. There's a lot of thinking that they probably don't. So they can say their little office doesn't have verifiable evidence, but that doesn't mean nobody in the US government has that evidence. And they're always very, again, literally accurate when they issue these statements for the most part. They're like, the AARO office has not found verifiable evidence. And you think that is the most lawyerly kind of response you could get, right? It's like, I think when it's so obvious they're using words like most or we, this little office in DoD, but forget about the rest of them, have not found this or that. It's like, why are you having to be so lawyerly in your responses around this stuff? And I mean, the answer is like lawyers might actually be involved in crafting some of these responses. That's how the DoD works. So, the huge lies can be perpetuated by half-truths. The overall impression that they provide can still end up really being a lie.
Have you ever thought about if these non-human intelligences are real, are they working with the US government? Because if they're not, why don't they just make themselves known worldwide to the public?
Yes, I do think about this an awful lot. And so do many other people who are fascinated with this topic. It's like, it's very philosophical, this topic, right? Like, yeah, we can talk about things flying around or whatever, but I love this about it. It's why I think I got fixated on it and why many people get really into it. It starts to just explode your thinking along so many different lines. For me, I'm kind of an information addict on some level. I'll admit to that. I love that it pulls my thinking in these types of directions. There are these murmurings that there is some level of collaboration between the government and these things, but I'll just say this. It's very hard for me to picture that happening in such a concrete way in my mind's eye, because these UAP are weird. They don't kind of act and behave like, a little ship in Star Trek that lands and the Vulcans pop out. I mean, people have those types of experiences. I'm not going to say they don't, but they still have these very strange, otherworldly, almost dreamlike aspects to them. I'm not saying that they're not real in some way. It's just, they're a little less tangible than we are the representatives of this group, and we happen to be able to speak your language, and we're communicating with you openly, and let's sign a deal. Most people's stories about these things, that it's just hard to picture it working that way, but it could. I don't know. I don't have the privileged information. But then I think about the following. The whole world knows about these things. They've known about them for decades and decades. As I said earlier, and you know this, you talk to people on your show all the time who see them, even have interactions. It's not that they're not making themselves known. It's not that they're not even interacting somewhat openly in certain cases. It's that it's not happening in a way that correlates how like we would do it. And maybe that's because they're not us, right? They have their own way of doing things, but they are operating somewhat openly. Like large groups have seen things, like, people see them all the time. All sorts of people see these things. I mean, I know many people have seen UFOs at this point. And like, not just a light that does something a little weird, like a UFO. I saw it clear as day in the middle of the afternoon kind of thing. I actually had a sighting like that a few years ago. So that stuff happens, and it's as open as can be. It's not like open up the hatch, come out, introduce yourselves to the world kind of thing. But, maybe they have their reasons, or maybe that's just not how they do things. Maybe they, prefer to kind of build up an awareness with the average people of the world more than go to who we deem our power centers. Maybe they want it to be a little more distributed than that. Maybe, in a sense, anyone that sees one of these things is acting in some kind of an ambassadorial role, right? Like, well, I'm just a person and I saw one of these things and it's right in front of me. And a lot of people have this impression like, this thing seems to be here for my benefit of seeing it in this weird circumstance that I happen to be in this moment. Like mine was like in the seat I'm in now, I saw something in the middle of the afternoon go by outside at the distance of like the helicopters I see all the time. It was at a strange moment of synchronicity. I was watching the return of the SpaceX Crew Dragon module. I had been watching it for 2 hours on my TV. In the last minute before it splashed down in the Gulf of Mexico, the TV is saying things like, the spacecraft is returning, here they come, And I see this thing out my window, like in my peripheral vision as I'm watching my TV. It's flashing at me. Like I see so much air traffic, Jeff, out of these windows. I've flown helicopters a little bit. I've studied aircraft for my entire life, including like high-tech, secret aircraft projects and stuff, just out of my interest, kind of connected to my UFO interest. Nothing distracts me in the air outside of my windows. And I had been watching this thing for 2 hours that I had been like waiting for this last 1 minute so I could go and take my afternoon walk and watch the guys come back to Earth that had been up on the ISS for a couple of months. Yet there was something in my window that was distracting me. And I had to make a split-second decision if I was going to keep my eyes completely focused on the thing I had been watching for a couple of hours, or I needed to like check out the thing that for some reason was distracting me out of my window. I made the decision to get up out of the window, and there was a shiny silver metallic oblong kind of lozenge thing. Could have been a disc seen from the side. It was making a weird glimmering, glinting light off of a particular, like a flashing, but irregular off of one portion of its shiny silver metallic body. And I guess it was probably about 45 seconds or so. I saw it just go off into the distance in the middle of the afternoon, clear as day. Last thing I saw of it was like the little sparkling, like it looked like a star in the sky in the middle of the afternoon, twinkling. I ended up looking at the aircraft records for the area. I knew the exact minute I had been looking at that thing because of the confluence of watching the SpaceX Crew Dragon return. You can go and look up all the flight data. There was no aircraft that was putting out the proper transponder messages that was tracked on those apps anywhere in the entire Baltimore Beltway region for even several minutes on either side of me seeing this thing. So it doesn't seem like it was an aircraft. I mean, it didn't look like an aircraft, but I wanted to check. And then I even ended up looking at the wind speed for my area in the time. Maybe it was a balloon. Again, I'm into UFOs. I want to research my own sighting in the way that a UFO investigator would research it. It was going much faster than the wind speed. So this was not a balloon. And again, no engines, no control surface. I don't remember any noise associated with it. And again, why I was in this seat in my living room, and it just at a pivotal moment when the TV is like, here comes the spacecraft. And I love watching that kind of stuff. So I was like on the edge of my seat, a little like excited that these guys were coming back. And and then like this thing is there. And I mean, I literally looked away from it and back a few times. I literally pinched myself. I was like, this is I've been looking up my entire life waiting for one of these things. And like, this is the moment. And I'm not even having to leave the seat I'm in or my living room. So like, I don't know how to interpret that. And I'm open to like maybe a stack of mistakes led to me interpreting something as what seemed like a very clear-cut traditional UFO sighting that wasn't. But, that would be a lot of strange confluences of mistakes happening all at once for it to just be, present in such a way. So, like, I don't know what that means, but that's not a terribly uncommon kind of UFO sighting story. So, like, whether or not it was, a lot of people who see these things feel they were kind of meant to see it in that way. That makes them feel that way about it. That sort of sounds like deliberate contact if you just take a, zoom out a little bit and you say there's a lot of those stories. So maybe they are, and they're just not doing it in a way that conforms to Earth human thinking about how you go about such a thing.
Do you think it's possible that the UFO, UAP activity is increasing exponentially and the government can't control it, obviously? So people like Lou Elizondo, David Grush, Dr. Greer are coming out as sort of a pressure release valve.
I get it. Like, build up a little more focus on something like this that would seem to have importance. So I hear this from some people, and we know, there are certain military bases or even ships in the ocean, whatever. Like, there are very recently, I mean, kind of ongoingly, like, this month kind of thing, sightings of these things to the point where they're having to move aircraft from bases like Langley Air Force Base. They literally moved some of our aircraft that were there because they were getting these like possible drone swarms. But the thing is, like possible drone swarms that don't really conform to how drone swarms would tend to really operate. And again, including like appearing above ships in the middle of the ocean and stuff that just doesn't really seem to be that necessarily. They kind of seem to be UFOs, whatever they are. There certainly seems to be a heightened sense that we're picking them up more. We also have many more cameras and sensors and everything pointing in every direction than we've ever had. And people have seen these things for a really long time. And that's not even getting to like historical sightings and, folk tales and mythology and, religion and all that stuff, which who knows? Maybe it's like more similar than we realize. Certainly a lot of people have had those thoughts. So there could be an increase. And we know that traditionally, even in the last 80 years, there have been waves of these things. And maybe we're in a little bit more of a wave phase now, and then maybe it'll dissipate in a few years. But I think it's just regular enough and causing interruptions to, military flight operations and war games that they're doing and actual kind of in-theater type operations or security around even our bases in the US. It's causing enough interruptions on a regular enough basis where shunting it off to the side is something that some of these insiders are not feeling is useful. That doesn't mean these things are like spying on our military because they're getting ready for an invasion. We don't really know how to interpret it, frankly. And again, we don't want to over-militarize our thinking around the topic because average people also see these things. But we have to remember last year, February 2023, it kind of like happened and then went away. The US government admitted it shot down or was trying to shoot down 3 UAP. They claimed this was NORAD, right? It was happened in the weekend right before the Super Bowl, leading up to the Super Bowl. In fact, the DoD did their press conference about it after the third one had been shot down in the second quarter of the Super Bowl, if I remember correctly. Not like they were trying to like keep it out of the public's awareness or anything by doing it in the middle of the Super Bowl, right? So we know that even NORAD is shooting these things down now. Now, what's interesting is that the public was told that none of those 3 UAP were recovered. And we even have the head of NORAD. He was asked directly in that press conference by Helene Cooper, a Pulitzer Prize winning defense journalist for the New York Times. She said, people are asking us, are these extraterrestrial? It's what people want to know. The guy, General Van Herk, who ran the NORAD shoot-down operations, said point blank he couldn't take it off the table until objects were recovered, which is a strange thing for the head of NORAD to say. So what happened? Canadian TV, CTV, got through Canadian Freedom of Information Act from February 15th, several days after those UAP shootdowns, because some of this was over Canadian airspace and the Canadians were involved, they're part of NORAD. A memo was released that had been sent to Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, days after these shootdowns, that said in that memo, by the way, there was actually 4 UAP engaged with over that several day period. The public was only told about 3. It explicitly says one of them had been taken into possession and had begun its so-called exploitation process. That just means the government is starting to look at it and figure out what they're even dealing with. Doesn't mean reverse engineering necessarily, but it means they had it in their possession. We were told that nothing was taken into our possession. And here's the really interesting thing. The memo actually says that these were UAP for the calendar year 2023, numbers 20, 21, 22, and 23. Just a week and a half into February for 2023. So NORAD is seeing these things on average, if you extrapolate, every 2 to 3 days. On average, we know that sometimes there's clusters like there were in those few days of February 2013. So they're seeing these things, Jeff, all the time. And even that DoD Aero office, which is often giving us hot air, has released certain metrics that indicate that this is kind of an everyday thing for the DoD. Now, that doesn't mean every single one of these things that they're picking up is like the famous Tic Tac from 2004 over the USS Nimitz that Dave Fravor testified about in Congress. I was a few feet behind him in that hearing. It was really great. I was able to slip in and witness that history of them testifying under oath about this stuff. Not everything is the Tic Tac, but they've acknowledged that a good several percent of their sightings are more like the Tic Tac in terms of extremely anomalous, apparently technological, but kind of magical looking stuff, so to speak. And they're seeing it all the time. So I do think some of the public comms that we're getting from these officials is this needs to get out of stigma zone, because whatever this is and whatever the intentions are, which might not even be something we can understand, might not be one set of intentions, we don't even know what we're really dealing with. What's the scope? I mean, are we talking about every other thing in the universe that might happen to have Earth in its path at some point? To say there's one set of intentions, I think would be kind of naive. Maybe every UFO has its own set of intentions. I don't know. But clearly, some of these insiders feel we need to sort of break through this stigma around the topic. So all of us, including warfighters and people in the intelligence community and the DoD, can just feel comfortable talking about it, addressing it, responding to it. Again, not even as a necessary threat, but as something we need to be able to talk about and be aware of and study and maybe try to get to the bottom of a little more. So I think that is motivating some of it.
It's amazing to think about if these beings have the technology to get here from wherever they come from, how they're allowing themselves to be shot down. And 2, why would we be shooting down something that's far more advanced technologically than we are?
It's an interesting conundrum that people have been wrestling with for a really long time. Now, there's a lot of hypotheses, and I'm not going to claim to know the answers here, right? And even if the government has shot them down, I don't know that even those guys know, how were we able to shoot this thing down or whatever. Certain lines of thinking are some of these have been brought down by electromagnetic pulse effects when we've set off nuclear weapons, when we were doing nuclear weapons testing. And the EMP pulse that's put off by a nuclear explosion might disrupt the systems of these things. Some people have offered that maybe they're allowing themselves to be shot down. I think the other thing is, again, we don't really know what we're dealing with in any of these circumstances. We don't know what it truly represents. I'm just hypothesizing here, but let's say you shoot down some, metal, silver, tic-tac looking thing the size of a Volkswagen Bug that's been darting around, northern Alaska or whatever. This is one of the objects from 2023. And I don't know for sure that it was taken into possession, but I'm hypothesizing here. let's say you shoot an AIM-9X Sidewinder missile at it and it takes it out and it crashes, and there was reports from the pilots that it broke into several pieces. This got leaked through CNN. What was that thing? Maybe it was just a probe. Maybe that thing's been around Earth for 10,000 years and it like ran out of gas and was acting wonky. And not literal gas, obviously, probably, but it's whatever. Maybe it was malfunctioning. Maybe they, in some cases, want their stuff to be taken into possession for whatever reason. Maybe that's some kind of a tech transfer. I don't know. But like, there's a lot of possibilities. Some of it could be that these things are largely expendable. Like we send probes and have drones that are essentially like expendable. Maybe some of this is expendable to them. Maybe they don't care if we get some of it into our possession. Or again, maybe some of that is sort of like the outcome that they're looking for. Hard to say, but I think we got to keep a lot of possibilities in mind. And that notion that like, gosh, if they got all the way here just to get shot down or crash, that doesn't make much sense. Well, the thing we're dealing with on Earth might have gotten here, 1,000 years ago. Or something might have reached our solar system 50,000 years ago and stationed itself somewhere. And all the stuff that we're seeing is like from that more localized presence, even though it still represents something that's connected to a, broad civilization, maybe. So because there's so many unknowns, I don't think we should make assumptions, but like, we don't know that if any UAP we come across made that full trek. Maybe that full trek took them 100 million years to get from some portion of just the Milky Way galaxy to our portion. And these are so-called, von Neumann probes, where they can mine resources from a local planet or whatever and build baby probes. And maybe that's just, we've been dealing with the baby probes that have been getting sent out from Saturn's moon for the last 10,000 years. So we just don't know, but we do know this. It's absolutely possible for things to travel between star systems even without going the speed of light. And this was something Enrico Fermi kind of solidified in a sense in Fermi's paradox. Fermi's paradox was basically interpreted as like, where are they? But like the crux of it was this. Yeah, space is really big. So but time is really long. So you can go a fraction of the speed of light. And if you started doing that and you were spreading self-replicating probes or something out, starting maybe 1 billion years ago, you could go a fraction of the speed of light. Accelerations that we're even starting to think through ourselves is how we might be able to send probes to other solar systems. Yeah, we started flying in space, less than 100 years ago, and we're already thinking about how to send things to other star systems. So these guys could have started doing that 1 million years ago, 1 billion years ago. Things could have just spread out. They could be self-replicating. They could be somewhat expendable and replaceable. So, yeah, okay, something that technically represents that class of technology got here and crashed. Okay. I mean, we have very high-tech fighter jets. Sometimes they crash too. So I think we shouldn't make any assumptions about what that necessarily means. There's a lot of unknowns right now.
Isn't there a recent paper from Harvard that talks about that there may be ETs living among us?
I think this is the master's paper that you're referring to, and he does a lot of interesting thinking. That paper is a great one. I should say this, my interpretation of it, and I think he would agree, is that the paper was a little bit more of a thought experiment on what the limits of science are based on all of the unknowns in our reality that we're dealing with. And that a very real possibility that a number of people take quite seriously is that some of this presence might be somewhat local. Like these are other things on Earth and have been on Earth potentially for a really long time. And we can't claim to have total information about everything happening on Earth. I mean, we know more about the surface of Mars at this point than what's under the ocean on Earth. So the idea, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Abyss, it finally became available again, through streaming services and stuff, and strongly recommend it. It at least sort of implies this kind of a scenario that there's something under the ocean that to us kind of looks like aliens, so to speak. Might be alien from a human standpoint, but it's kind of local. The way I look at it, and again, I don't think he was saying definitively that's the case. He's saying, like, we don't know. It could be something more like that than something that came from outer space. And I think that is absolutely, one of the possibilities at play. And there's also the possibility that we're dealing with multiple things. Not every UAP looks or acts or whatever like every other UAP. So I think this is a so-called heterogeneous phenomenon in that there could be multiple things going on at once. Some things might actually sort of be able to be fit into multiple categories. This is why thinking through kind of the terminology we use and everything is a really important part of this process, because it's like a lot of people want to put these things into mutually exclusive categories. They want to say, well, is it from outer space or is it some secret thing from Earth? I think about it a little differently. I've always thought about a lot of things a little differently. So I don't necessarily look at these as mutually exclusive categories. I actually saw, it was either Lou Elizondo or someone using a similar metaphor recently, and I was psyched because it's one that I had kind of come across. Think about one of those ant mounds on the African savanna, right? This big thing, all these ants crawling around, doing their thing out in the wilderness, and let's say no humans ever came across that. Like they just never walked up to it. They've never been in that little corner of the world. All those ants are just doing their ant thing without any contact with humans ever. And then let's say one day, a human walks up to one of those things on the savannah and like pokes it or, dumps something on it or pushes it over or just steps on some ants or whatever. And suddenly those domains have sort of converged. The human domain and that ant mound are now kind of in alignment. And then the human goes away and the ants are gone. Like the ants like aren't exposed to that human presence anymore. There was that brief moment, right? But the reality is the ants are both natives of Earth, and the human that came across the ant mound is a native of Earth. And it's just that human had a broader domain that includes the ant mound sometimes, but also is much broader than that little patch of Earth that the ant mound is on and that one colony inhabits. And so, like, the ants might think of that thing as being from outside. Not to say ants think these things about humans, but like the frame of reference would be like, that's an outsider coming here and then going away. But the reality is they're really just, they have different domains, and the ant domain is contained within the human domain when the humans want to go there specifically, right? So when I think about this kind of crypto-terrestrial, or like things that are from here or centered on Earth, the problem with that thinking and like, is it ET or is it from here? That entire framework sort of forgets that Earth is in just the middle of space right now. Space isn't somewhere far away, and there's other things out there in space. We're in space, right here on the surface of the Earth. Us having this conversation right now, we're in space. So I think like maybe there's stuff that Earth is in its domain, maybe has been in its domain a really long time. Maybe there's a more local presence on Earth that kind of is Earth-centered for whatever set of reasons. But it doesn't necessarily mean that thing we sometimes bump into on Earth that maybe even has been on Earth for 100,000 years or a million years or whatever it might be, isn't somehow connected with other stuff that has that broader cosmic domain. So I think one of the things I believe, and maybe I'll be proven wrong, but is that as we learn more about this topic, we're going to have to like redefine our schema for how we think about these things, and things that we like to think of in mutually exclusive terms. We might realize we either need entirely new terms, or we might end up being like, actually, it's like 7 of those things all at once in this one thing we're bumping into. So, just another way of looking at it.
I know you're not one of my psychic guests, But what do
Or
you,
yeah, how do you know that?
no, that's true. But what do you foresee coming up within the UAP disclosure movement in the near future?
So let me speak a little more groundedly now about what's kind of going on legislatively and whatnot. And again, this is how your audience can be part of this process, because that's what it's going to take, as I said earlier. This is a movement linking elbows kind of thing now. I think more will come from insiders. I mentioned earlier, H.R. McMaster was on Bill Maher last night saying this is for real and our science doesn't have its head wrapped around it. That's like, we're getting a stream of these folks like every week or two now. So like, that's going to be part of it. And those officials, and some of which I have even loose connections to, I'm making sure that they understand, this is what we want to see, and the pressure is kind of building. But it's really going to be on the public at this point. So I mentioned that we've had a few years of legislative wins relating to this, even if it hasn't fully panned out to like disclosure. I'm sorry, these things just don't happen in a year or 2 years. We're talking about a really big paradigm change. And this is the kind of thing that it's going to take a little while to work through. And I think we're a good way through that process now. So every year there's what's called the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. And it tends to fold in both sort of the armed services and intelligence community related, legislation for the year. And the last 3+ years, I say 3+, it's technically 4 years of these NDAA bills and the Intelligence Authorization Act that gets folded into it have had legislation specifically related to UFOs, UAP, because they're defined in these bills as unidentified anomalous phenomena. That's now a legal term enshrined in federal legislation, which itself is a huge win. But we have years where they're kind of fine-tuning legislation around revealing more information to the public, creating bodies within government, doing oversight into what might have been happening behind the scenes. There was a major inspector general of the DoD released a major report last year, actually, that led to the Joint Chiefs issuing a major command for all of the combatant commands to kind of get their shit in order as it relates to UAP. There's the Intelligence Community Inspector General is in the midst of an investigation now, and a lot of this has been spawned by this kind of legislative activity. So what's happening now, and if your audience wants to like take a few notes, I'm gonna really encourage this, because again, I think their action here is paramount, and being involved with this process. Disclosure is sort of legislation and insiders, but more than anything, it's going to be the public pushing for it, in a very coherent way. So right now, the fiscal year 2025 National Defense Authorization Act is being crafted. I'll do a quick little legislation lesson for folks. Some folks know this, some folks don't. Major bills that get put together for our government that come out of Congress and then get signed into law by the president, the House of Representatives and the Senate often create their own versions of these bills. They're separate, there's some overlap, there's some differences. Each of those bodies, the House and the Senate, passes and votes on their own version of the bill. But then later in the year, they have to go through a process that's called reconciliation. Unfortunately, it's very opaque. This is like backroom negotiations at the committee leadership level that takes these two bills, like the House's version of the NDAA and the Senate's version of the NDAA, and they have to consolidate them into one piece of legislation that then goes back to the House of Representatives and goes back to the Senate. And now each of those bodies again have to pass what is now a unified, standardized version of the bill. When both of those bodies do that, it goes up to the president to be signed into law. And again, that process has led to now technically 4 years of UAP legislation getting signed into law. Trump began this by initiating a report that became the UAP Task Force report that I think came out in 2021. And that was just a little thing that was slipped into one of the NDAAs. And then Biden has signed the last 3 years that have significantly more legislation on the UAP topic. So the FY25 NDAA It's now the second year they're trying to get a bill passed, again, introduced by Schumer and Rounds. This year it's headed by Rounds, called the UAP Disclosure Act. And if anyone ever wanted the government to have UFO disclosure, and you would imagine there probably needs to be some legal framework for doing that, this bill is disclosure. The UAP Disclosure Act is the legislative framework for disclosure to occur. So last year, they put it forth, and the Senate included it in their version of the FY24 NDAA. And unfortunately, when the reconciliation process happened, certain elements were stripped out. There was supposed to be an independent review board that was going to be given all the security clearances and could delve into any secret programs and then make recommendations on which things to declassify after running it through the president. Unfortunately, that independent review board was stripped out. A few other elements were stripped out of it. However, one portion was preserved, which was that the National Archives and Records Administration needs to stand up, and the website now exists. You can Google National Archives UAP records, and it pops right up. A front end for where all of these government agencies are now supposed to send all of their UAP UFO records to. So what was passed last year was every federal agency, civilian, military, and intelligence community agencies have to send every record that they have on file relating to the UAP topic broadly to National Archives. And the presumption is that records 25 years and older should be declassified. They do have to go through a review process. And that actually made it into last year's bill. And there is a review process going on now at government federal agency level to review UFO records. And some have actually already started to pop up on that National Archives website. But we don't have the independent review board, which gives a little bit more of a, call it a police force, to look for those records and do the investigation. The original UAP Disclosure Act included like an actual both national level and international disclosure program where even high-level government officials in the US were supposed to engage with foreign officials of similar titles and encourage them to disclose their records on the topic and become more transparent. Few other elements of the bill didn't make it in. So we want the full UAP Disclosure Act to be included in this year's FY25 NDAA. It's very important. This gives it much more meat than just standing up that records repository at the National Archives. And so the Senate has just been on break, and so is the House. They're coming back into session Monday. That's September 9th for your audience. What's going to be happening on the Senate side is that the Senate is finalizing their version, because we're still at this point where the House already passed their version of the NDAA. Unfortunately, it's pretty common to how this has worked the last few years. Most of the UAP legislation has come from the Senate side. So the Senate is in the final phases of finalizing what they want to be included in their National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025. They're crafting what's called the manager's package of amendments to the NDAA that will be kind of built into the Senate's version that they're going to be passing probably in just the next week or two. That's the rough time frame. And so right now, the thing we are pushing for, and what all of your listeners should do, and I can give them a few very specific resources like my website and some others that will help them with this, but we want people to engage, especially right now, their two federal senators, and tell them, call their DC office, and again, I'll give you a few URLs as well. Tell them to include the full UAP Disclosure Act in the Senate's NDAA and their manager's package of amendments for the FY25 NDAA. The UAP Disclosure Act needs to be in there. And we're going to probably find out in a couple of weeks if we're successful with that. We know that there's 3 Senate committees that if any of your audience, any of their senators or either the leadership or even just on these committees, they're particularly important. It's the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Select Intelligence Committee, and what's called the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. We get the impression that the minority leadership on government affairs and Homeland Security, who is Rand Paul, might be offering a little pushback on this. So if Rand Paul is your senator, please call him and tell him we need the full UAPDA in the manager's package of amendments for the FY25 NDAA, because this is the step we're on as far as disclosure. If the UAPDA doesn't make it into the Senate's version of the NDAA bill now, Jeff, it's going to be much harder for it to get into the final version of the NDAA that gets massaged out through that reconciliation process, which is more of like a late November, early December timeframe kind of thing. So we kind of got to jump this hurdle right now to get it in the Senate's version. It's why the Senate needs to be all of your audience's focus. And then once we jump that hurdle, we can take a little bit of a breather for a couple months. And then at the end of the year, we need to make the emphasis on both the Senate and the House side past the UAPDA. So this is why I really set up Declassify UAP, right? I wanted there to be the typical kind of website that when you think of an issue, even or any side of an issue that we engage with in politics, it could be the environment, it could be rights for a certain group, or gun legislation or whatever. There's a website to go to. It gives you clear-cut information on the topic. There's sort of like the action center. There's the typical little form. You fill out a few fields, you hit a button. It sends a message to your own officials, your own elected officials as a constituent. And I was like, I've worked with all of these types of DC orgs in the past, think tanks and nonprofits and environmental groups, what have you. That's sort of what informed me when I was creating Declassify UAP. I was like, where's that for UFO transparency? Where's that for UFO declassification? Where's that for disclosure? And actually me and a few other groups, and I'm going to give a few of these URLs in a moment for people to take down, we've been organizing, we've been collaborating together, and a few of us had this idea all at once. There needs to be the more typical mechanisms that give people an easy way to engage with their representatives around this issue, that gives them clear-cut, very grounded information. I didn't want to cram any set of beliefs around this topic down anyone's throat. In fact, when I designed Declassify UAP, Jeff, I was even thinking of those skeptical debunkers in the back of my head. I was like, could I design this in a way that even a real skeptic around the topic could at least support the ask in the way I'm framing it, that we are framing it, if people take part in the campaign, that is so grounded and just fact-based and doesn't, take any ultimate explanation and say, this is what it is and you need to tell us this. It's, we deserve the truth wherever it leads as it's best understood, despite any unknowns that might exist, period. So declassifyuap.org is my website. You go to the Action Center, takes about 20-30 seconds, fill out a few fields of information in the form. I'm the only person and the company that runs that piece of software that does this. No one else has that information. No one else is getting it. It's totally private. But and I know people are sensitive around that, especially with the UAP issue, but as they should be in these days in general, giving out their personal information. It's not getting out there, folks. So fill out the few fields that's needed so it can route the campaign message to your own elected officials and send that. It takes 20-30 seconds, and try to get some of your friends and family. Declassifyuap.org. And there's also a call tool. And I would love some of your audience members to do this week and reach out, especially again now, to their 2 senators in DC. Go to the call tool and tell them the Rounds-Schumer UAP Disclosure Act, the bill is SA 2610, must be included in the Senate manager's package of amendments for the FY25 National Defense Authorization Act. It's Senate Bill S 4638. And they ought to make that phone call to the DC office of their 2 senators. This is about 3 to 4 minutes of their life to make those 2 Senate calls. And then try to see if you can get anyone else to do it. I'm going to give you, in addition to declassifyuap.org, 2 more wonderful resources, and folks should use all of them. So one of my collaborators is an organization called uapcaucus.com. That's UAPCAUCUS.com. Caucus being kind of a group working towards a political end, and this represents a group of the public as a caucus pushing for UAP transparency. uapcaucus.com/call has a call tool that actually allows you to engage with some of the other key senators and representatives who are influential to both the passage of the UAP Disclosure Act and the UAP topic generally. So after you've reached out to your 2 senators, your own 2 senators as their constituent, because that's a very powerful voice, they really do pay attention. Try to call a couple of these other folks. Maybe call Rand Paul. Maybe call Schumer and Rounds, who are the 2 Senate leaders their names are on this bill, and say, we want you to fight for this, guys. We want you to make sure your bill is in there. Call a few of these other senators who are, the leader and the minority leader on Senate Intel and Senate Armed Services, those committees. Use uapcaucus.com/call to reach out to those other senators. And then finally, there's the UAP Disclosure Fund.com. And this is a group that's also trying to do advocacy around transparency. Folks like Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, some of these others are their advisors. And they are also just really trying to push for this. And they too have a little tool that you can fill out a few fields. And it's a petition that's being sent to all of these congressional leaders to tell them this is what the public wants right now. So passage of this UAP Disclosure Act is the thing going on right now. There will always be more going on, again, what some of these insiders are up to, some of these public statements that people are making. But what we really need right now is for the public to make noise in support of this and to be part of the disclosure process. This is what gets it into the end zone. And we have to be okay with that not being immediate. There's a lot of bills that a lot of groups have fought for sometimes for decades and not made progress on until they do. We have 4 years of solid wins legislatively, major elected officials, the leader of the Senate, all of these serious folks supporting this effort vehemently. And that's a real win. And this movement for disclosure has to learn to take these wins and champion them and then build on them for the next set of wins. So being part of this process, this is what's going on now. And the next week or 2 are huge for people to get involved.
Nick, thank you so much for creating this website and all the hard work you've put into this. Before we wrap it up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
There's so many, but one of the things that I really like about this topic is some people are not into it, and that's okay. I don't need everyone to be fascinated with UAP. People have their lives they're living and mundane aspects and paying for their rent or whatever. I get it. Not everyone is going to be into this. But one of the things I love about the topic, and more people are getting into it all the time because of these books like Lou Elizondo's and the New York Times articles and statements like H.R. McMaster's on Bill Maher's show last night. And all of this stuff is getting more and more people interested. That amazing historic congressional hearing from last year. And one of the things that just tickles me about this, Jeff, I'm a real pluralist, as we say. I think, especially in America, with so many different types of people here in this country, the indigenous population, people from all over the world, of every nation, every cultural group, every background, every religion, who have converged on the United States and have made it their home. And a lot of us have to live next to each other and work together, and our kids are on baseball teams together and all of it. It's a very diverse country. It's a really pretty amazing thing that we can all get along. There's a lot of countries that are much less diverse than the United States. Especially right now, we have many different political beliefs, cultural beliefs. I mean, the schism in society, I'm very pained by the degree to which it's kind of raised its head right now. this topic, for whatever reason, brings people together. I've noticed this in my own activism and advocacy work around it. I mean, I'm a pretty progressive guy, I'm not going to lie. I have lifelong conservatives I'm working with elbow in elbow to push this topic forward. And we get to know each other and relate to one another as human beings. We actually learn a lot of the time. We actually agree on an awful lot. In fact, I think most people agree on most everything other than the way to get to where we're trying to go. There's a lot of room for debate on that stuff. I think most, especially Americans, but people around the world, have a similar set of visions as to like the kind of world we want to live in. And the fact that in Washington in 2024, this is a bipartisan issue where you have staunch Republicans, staunch, hardcore liberals, progressives, literally like putting their names on a bill, the UAP Disclosure Act, and saying this affects everybody, everyone deserves the truth. It starts to create, not just around UFOs, but around all sorts of topics, lines of conversation that we probably need to be having more of with one another instead of just this at each other. And so, if any of your listeners find themselves on the conservative end of the spectrum ideologically, very progressive, very independent, they've tapped out of the two-party system, wherever you are in that set of perspectives, there are people that share your worldview that are working together to get the truth about UFOs out there to the people once and for all, for us to be leveled with by our elected officials as to what the heck is going on. That has literally held the public's fascination, Jeff, for 3/4 of a century. Think about that. We're almost a century into this thing. So it brings me a huge amount of satisfaction that we have people from all across the spectrum, all walks of lives, government insiders, and the ultimate people who consider themselves outside of that system, literally working together, everything in between, around something that I think most people agree. If there's some meat on these bones, this is bigger than all of that. It might even put some of our very human and somewhat mundane differences into a new light, a new perspective, if we suddenly realize we're not maybe as alone in this universe as we thought for a long time. And the other thing I'll remind people of, through most of recorded human history, in our ontology, our framework as humans for the nature of reality, how we think about things, almost every culture across time and across lands has had a place in their worldview for other beings, often more advanced than ourselves, who have a relationship with us, a presence from time to time on Earth. And that was stripped away through the age of reason. We got to this point where we almost needed to like throw all of that away and then use the scientific method to sort of build back up our awareness of the nature of reality, almost starting from scratch. And, the problem with that is things can still be true even if they're not scientifically verified. Science isn't truth. Truth is truth. What humans have scientifically verified is a small subset of this thing called reality. And for thousands of years, human reality could accommodate this kind of a thing. And now we're needing to sort of build it into our new set of frameworks, a scientific way of looking at the world, a very rigidized, and testable view of the world. I actually think these things are useful. Again, I've been part of UAP science efforts. I think it's very important. But it doesn't mean that these truths hadn't been arrived at in other ways for maybe a very long time. And I think, it might have caused us some problems societally by forgetting about the fact that maybe we're not alone in this existence thing. And I think people of all stripes see that spark of possibility in this topic. Doesn't matter if they're a hardcore conservative or super ultra liberal progressive or somewhere in between or a total independent. Like, that's obvious. Like, that would be a huge thing to even like have that acknowledgement that yes, this is real. And the acknowledgement again is being made. It's being made. It just needs to come in a more official form. Here are the intelligence assessments. Yes, these are the possibilities that are officially on the table. We might not even have solid answers on it, but getting it in that more official form is important. So the bringing together of humans, like, we're talking about something that sounds very far out and maybe in some ways outside of us. It may end up being something that is more useful just to us as us than a lot of people realize. And if it can even begin to allow us to build bridges that I think really need to be like reconstructed now in our society, because a lot of it has been like so exaggerated by social media and algorithms and even like foreign powers that are trying to stoke dissent between Americans and all sorts of stuff. Like, we need to like get back to reality in some way. And I think coming together as a society and even maybe a planet around something like this and having like awe and mystery and majesty, something that becomes available to all of us as a group that we can kind of coalesce around. I think the possibilities of what that could allow for are eye-opening. I mean, I get a little choked up, frankly. I am now just thinking about it. And the fact that for that to happen, it really is going to take the public working together, including with folks that we don't always agree with about everything, and giving a consistent message to our government officials and not treating the government like a them and the deep state. There are truths to those problematic aspects of it. But I've worked with these people. They're just human beings like you and me. Like, they have their lives, they have kids, they have baseball practices. They're not sitting around in offices conspiring against us or how can we get as much money into. It doesn't really work like that. Like, there are problems, but even coming into a better relationship with our government officials, the amount of healing that I think can occur in our society by acknowledging, wow, if the government can finally open up about that, like, maybe there's something we can save there. Maybe there's something we can improve. Maybe improvement is possible, especially when we treat those officials like regular human beings and try to appeal to them as human beings and appeal to them as the public together. There is really no end to what that even starts to do for us outside of this topic. It gives us a pathway to take on other big things that we're facing right now: change in the environment, global warming, geopolitics, major conflicts that are occurring. If we can come together around this, I think it will spark in us the realization that we can come together to do anything. So please, folks, go to declassifyuap.org, call your senators, call your reps, push for the UAP Disclosure Act, and be willing to work with people who might not seem like they're quite your people, but let's come together around this and then see what that leads to. I'm very hopeful.
Nick, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
It's a huge pleasure and honor. And I'll just say, Jeff, I know I mentioned this to you. My mom has been a longtime listener of yours. She loves you. She loves your program, your guests. I know many other people who watch it. I've checked out episodes from time to time, and it is just a real privilege to be able to be here with you and your audience like this. It means the world to me.
Well, thank you, and please send my love to your mom.
I will indeed.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.